want to thank you for taking the time out to chat with me. I want to thank you guys for taking the time out to uh, tune in. We're just going to talk a little bit about Chayse practice and just things like that. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the question box. Just let me know if everyone can hear me. It looks like a little bit of a delay here on my end, but if everyone can hear me, just thumbs up or and and Chayse, do you mind talking for a little bit just to see if everyone can hear you? Can everyone hear Chayse?
Hello, can everyone hear me? Thumbs up? Yeah, nice.
Perfect. So I kind of want to start kind of backtracking a little bit towards the beginning of this year, and kind of talk about like what did it feel like when this year started? Like maybe if there were expectations or just notions of this year when it started, and obviously how does it feel now? I mean, how has that evolved, basically?
Yeah, I think I had signed on to shoot a film. I think maybe the second or third week of January, but I had gone through several meetings with um, the director and the crew, the crew prior to that, and I was just getting in the headspace of it, and kind of maybe 2 or 3 weeks before things started to shut down, I was interviewing a lot of crew members in New York, kind of 6 or 7 a day. It was quite the task. I would do that every weekend. So I was kind of gearing up to be full on. And about a week before I was supposed to start pre-production on the movie, the film shut down because it couldn't receive insurance.
Mm,
Um, it was like the day that they closed all the stores and everything was the day that the production designer and art department were supposed to start day one of prep. So I had this kind of, I was hyper focusing on this one thing, and I had also moved to Bed-Stuy, so I was kind of setting up my new living conditions here and all that. So I mean, I couldn't have anticipated it. In fact, I was having conversations with my mother, and she was very, very concerned very early on,
mm,
maybe in January or early February, about the disease. And I wasn't that concerned at all. I was more concerned for her, um, the anxiety level that she was experiencing over the virus. I was kind of like, oh well, she's in remission from cancer. So I
mhm.
was really, I was trying to pacify her fears, but at the same time, I was completely ignorant of the facts.
Mm. And, and in what ways feel the ripple within the film industry, like it was it more so like the pragmatic side, like things being handled, or were there nuanced things that kind of like have there been nuanced things that have kind of like revealed themselves or within the film industry that you've seen this effect? This,
Sorry, you're breaking up there a little bit. I'm not totally
Nick,
sure the
I'm
question.
curious about like the features or the vulnerabilities that or that your practice like take effect with this virus. There have been they've already been like healed, or if there are any, if there are like look like, because I know at least within my personal experience, like looking within the photo community and seeing the things that are happening, or just as freelancers. I don't know if it uh, parlays into freelance or you.
You're kind of breaking up, but let me just try to reiterate maybe what you said.
Hear me now?
I can hear you.
Wait, sorry,
Yeah,
can you hear me? Am I loud and
yeah.
clear? Okay. Uh,
Well, I'll get little hits of your sentences, but then it'll cut out kind of like mid-sentence, so it's hard to.
Sorry. Wait, can you guys hear me loud and clear? I just put this on. I still breaking
No,
up?
it's still breaking. Yeah, it's still breaking up.
1 second here, sorry. So can you still hear me?
Yeah,
Good? Loud and clear? Okay, perfect. I was
yeah.
just kind of curious.
I'm worried that. Sorry, say it again.
Am I still breaking up? Okay, I'm gonna. Okay, this is weird. Okay, I'm gonna just. Hopefully, we can like piece this together here.
Okay.
Um, but I'm curious about the fissures within the film industry that this virus has basically like affected. Like other than like cancellations, has there been any other things that have been affected within your practice?
Um, yeah, I mean everything's just completely shut down. Usually I get quite a few inquiries per week about my availability, and that's not happening anymore at all. I mean, it's pretty much shut down. There's only been one or two kind of art house filmmakers that have reached out to me to kind of document my own experience, kind of what's happening in my place and my point of view
Mm,
with my iPhone and stuff like that, those kind of projects, which are really interesting. But as
mm,
far as work, I'm pretty concerned about the future of the industry, only because back in 2009, I was immigrating to the States, and it was kind of the height of the recession. And I remember I had this great meeting with this this guy named Denny Claremont. He ran Claremont Cameras,
mhm,
and we had lunch, and he kind of told me a lot of tales. And at the end of the meeting, he was kind of like, when you start in this business, you won't work for like 2 years, and then after that 2 years is up, you won't be able to stop working. And I remember I maybe 4 years later, and I still wasn't working at all. And uh, and then maybe halfway through that fourth year, everything started to click, and I started to work a lot. And that was 5 or 6 years ago. And I kind of always I look back at it now, really thinking that it was potentially the recession that kind of wiped out so much work for all the young cinematographers like myself. So I'm pretty concerned that might be a repeat, and there'd just be like, I don't know, but the back then people didn't really know how to make money on the internet with films, and
mm.
now they do. They really know how to make a lot of money on the internet with films. So
Yeah. I mean,
maybe it's a novel kind of situation. I don't really know what to expect. You kind of have to take it day by day and just react to it.
yeah, because we have this not intersection per se, but there is a higher accessibility or a better accessibility. Obviously, people just showing what they want, like for artists to themselves in whatever medium and whatever capacity, just technologically, it's just a little bit easier. But obviously, we're in an unprecedented situation, so we don't know how long that will last for, and what just that, and there's so many more questions and answers. So it's definitely.
Totally, and I think there's a big question of how to make film crews feel safe
Mm,
as we start to come back to work. That's like, I don't really know the answer to that personally. I would imagine like, protective equipment for all crew members, but potentially testing. Um, Hopefully they get the testing situation figured out a little bit more. I've heard that there's machines now that can test within 15 minutes or give a result within 15 minutes, but they're individual tests, so I don't know how you would do a whole crew, but I could see productions being really scaled down in their crew sizes, um, offering testing and that kind of stuff on the set, and then everyone wearing protective equipment.
hmm And because it's interesting because within film, it's so collaborative. If you're a director, there's a photographer, there's so many elements to it. It's not just like being a photographer where you do have kind of that singular luxury of just being out with your camera yourself. So it is interesting to see
Mm-hmm.
how that will parlay. But I kind of want to backtrack a little bit and just talk about your practice in a general scope. And one of the things I've seen you talk about is how your mom was a jazz vocalist. A lot of what you, a lot of your practice is within the, or the ideology, or like how you work is cognizant of that. Because I remember talking with a guest on my website about the improvisation involved in jazz, and how have you managed to feel comfortable enough to like use that be in the pocket kind of like phrase with your workflow? Like how have you, when did you become comfortable, I guess, to like instill that, to know that, okay, this is the way how I was gonna like approach my work?
Um, it's kind of like trial and error. I think, initially when you're learning a lot about the craft of filmmaking, you really want to protect yourself. So you come up with, uh, you try to anticipate every single scenario and through shot listing and that kind of stuff, and doing lighting diagrams. And I mean, that I started my career doing a lot of that. And I think honestly, a lot of the jazziness that I started to explore in myself, it started in music videos, um, kind of my feature film work as well. I had done a movie called My Days, where in my initial meeting with the director, Andrea, he told me that he wanted every frame in the film to be a masterpiece. And I remember really digesting that, like, whoa, that's like a huge challenge. Like, how do you do that? Um, so then on the set, when we started executing kind of the ideas, we didn't necessarily have a lot of time to shot list everything. And then what ends up happening is you start to overthink a lot of things. So we had only gotten so far into that process before we started shooting, and then we were forced to improvise. But the challenge was always like we have to set the bar up here with it, the composition, framing, and lighting of every shot, and then almost entirely between blocking and setting up, our our minds were focused on trying to make it really interesting and special each frame. And that just kind of it, I don't know what it is. It's maybe the challenge of that idea uh kind of fueled a lot of improvisation. And um you know you I think what happens is you have an idea in your mind about a particular shot, and you frame it up, and it doesn't always translate. Actually, a lot of times for me it doesn't translate. uh like I'll have this kind of like beautiful montage in my mind, and as I'm starting to execute it, it'll not really feel, it'll either come off contrived or overlit or blah blah blah. And the more I started to divert away from that and improvise a lot more, the more it started to feel like it had like this really soulful emotional essence to it. And then I started working with Khalil Joseph, and he was like that on steroids, because he actually conceals almost every intention he has from me.
Mm.
So, so we will scout and we'll kind of work on a project together. In some scenarios, like I'll very early on, like in Lemonade, I went over to his house probably like a couple months before we shot it, and we just like roll a spliff and have a bunch of art books around and just kind of talk really abstract ideas about whatever the books we're looking at are, like, we would just any type of shit like this, like we would just grab.
What book is this?
Uh, this is Todd Heido's book. It's just the one closest to me. And then we'd take like, here, I'll grab a better example.
Oh.
this book, Police Work,
Mhm.
by Leonard Freed,
Mm.
and you just go through it and you start tabbing kind of the frames that speak to you in a poetic sense.
Yeah. But this when you're cognizant of like the type of atmosphere that the film will hold, or is this like
No, this is like anything's possible. You have no idea what you're doing. And you just kind of start going through these images and you tab them. And then afterwards, when you're sober, you kind of like start to digest it. and figure, you might see it in a different way, and you want to start to construct a scenario in which you can, capture these moments. And Khalil kind of sets it up almost like I'm more like a photojournalist than I am a cinematographer.
mm,
So when he basically sets scenes up as events, and he's actually not even really there a lot of the time when you're shooting. So he'll want a guy, dancing or doing something, and he'll set it up, and he'll be like, Chase, come over here and shoot this. And then I'll start shooting it, and then he'll disappear, and he'll be setting up something totally different. And then he'll come over to me after when I'm reloading or doing something else, and he's like, okay, come over here and do this. Do you shoot this over here? And then he'll disappear again. And I have nothing else except my like intuition to kind of respond to these events happening. But my intuition has kind of been prepped through digesting these images here. Do you know what I mean? So it's almost like I'm trying to I don't know, I guess I sort of hypnotize myself
mm,
by viewing these kind of compositions and information and images, and trying to interpret that into like very simple themes or soul, like some sort of essence that then I'm trying to remind myself of in the moment. So it becomes like kind of an intuitive expression.
mm.
um yeah, I hope that explains it.
I think it does, and it's funny that you're like mentioning lemonade because one of the things you've talked about that's interesting and that was interesting to note was how you were mentioning how through observing like Henry Cartier-Bresson's like idea of like veiled erotic, like that idea of creating some sense of mystery within a frame, and how you did that with a few of the frames in like Lemonade. One thing when I was thinking about when seeing that was how much does photography influence? Because just obviously thinking like with the Hito book, like how much does photography inform obviously your work? Because it's not to say it's the same thing or isn't, but obviously there's a narrative to it. There's a sequence to what you're doing rather than like still, you know.
Yeah, it's actually one of the premier languages that I'm trying to adapt to cinema in my mind. Like, when I go through a photography book, like I've, you know, talked about with Khalil or other collaborators, I feel a very similar emotion to what would be translated as the cinematic emotion,
Mm,
or cinema. When I flip those pages and there's maybe information that's like uh, concealed, or the image is actually really coy,
mm,
or it's clever, or it's humorous, but it takes a second or a beat to kind of translate it because there's so much information over the whole thing that you can kind of dissect. And I don't actually see that in cinema that often. There's some filmmakers that do it. So that really excites me because um, I can bring that to the format. And it's not to say that I'm always doing that. I wouldn't say I was doing that on Black Klansman or anything like that. That was much more of like a professional project rather than like an artistic expression.
mhm.
Um, but when I do get the opportunity, it's pretty, rewarding and fulfilling.
And does the length of a project dictate that, or in what, or like what is the context of time within a project in regards to that, or in regards just generally to shooting? Like how much of that affects the process, or
Like you're asking, during the duration of a shoot, how much does my process change or evolve, or is
well,
it?
like the duration of a project, like from a music video to like a almost 2 hour film, like how does
Oh, yeah. How does that whole thing change? I mean, it's tricky on features because it's much more. I use a lot of adrenaline when I shoot. Um, yeah, I don't know exactly how that's triggered. Typically, it's kind of like more. I become really determined to create something really special, kind of in the preparation process. So when I'm on the set and something's not uh, you know, achieving that special feeling that I'm going for, something triggers in my brain where adrenaline starts going through, and I'll start fucking things up essentially, or messing around with the image and stuff. So I I have like a lot of energy go through me, and I'm actually a pretty like slow person um, in my daily life,
yeah.
and so there's something about the whole thing and I guess that's kind of like being in the pocket a little bit too. But what happens on a movie is I get really depleted after a while because I'm using all my resources of adrenaline, and you know, on the weekends when we're down, I'm completely lethargic and
Mm.
can't really function. So I think, going forward, my goal is to kind of like uh, mitigate that a little bit more, be a little bit more, I don't know. We'll see what kind of results are yielded from it, but I'm trying to like be a little bit more, uh, boost my stamina a little bit so I can go a little bit longer because it is really hard on a commercial or a music video or kind of a small form art project. It's not that bad, because they're only a few days, but on a film, it's really difficult.
And what have you found yourself allow, well, like what successful methods have you found to like allow you to recalibrate after a shoot? Because that's the thing. It's a, as you like, I love that you mentioned that, because like in most capacities, it's a very physically, mentally, creatively, it's a taxing thing. So how do you recalibrate from that, especially if it's after like a 24-day shoot or something of that nature?
Ugh, I like that question, but it's also has a dark answer.
Just roll a spliff and you just call it.
No, no, it's actually, I kind of I usually feel pretty depressed after a shoot. It's hard to recalibrate. I'll experience like a lot of shame and guilt for not achieving my goal and stuff like that, like, all right, I could have done better here and I failed. And
Mm.
these are all very much internal conversations that aren't necessarily projected onto me. Like, I finished a movie in December. No, not sorry, not December, October. And I was working with a filmmaker who I really admired, and he was so nice and generous to me the whole time and very complimentary. But for some reason, I always thought he was lying to me. And but that was all in my head, really, because I was just like, no, you got to do better. You got to do better. No, you're not doing it. Like, it looked overlit, or I'd always say that stuff to myself. So it's really tricky, I'm like trying to get over that stuff now and, uh, you know,
Well,
feel a bit more fulfilled.
what helps you? Is there anything that helps you kind of like disarm that? Is it seeing the finished results? Is it seeing reactions from people you respect?
Oh yeah, no, for sure. The results, seeing what like Khalil does in the edit with Luke Lynch is always like a pleasure. And they invite me into the edit too, to kind of chill with them, and watching them kind of do it is just so. I mean, when I saw the first cut of Lemonade,
Hmm.
in maybe like 2 months before it came out. They had cut like a complete masterpiece. I cried like 3 or 4 times during it. It's not what's out there. It's a completely different version. It was like 45 minutes. The songs only played for like a minute or so. The cinematic interludes were much longer. And Khalil was editing kind of metaphors that had pretty bold themes in
Mm.
them, so that they were a little bit more controversial and stuff like that. He was using like, archival footage of Malcolm X and that kind of stuff, which I think some of that's still in there, but it was just like all that really emotional stuff in Lemonade times 10. Um, so, seeing that kind of stuff when I'm sitting in the cut with them or on any film is really inspiring and makes me, it's I remember coming out of that really being like, oh, this is the best thing I've ever done, hands down.
And that's a beautiful feeling, right? That's
Yeah.
the fleeting but momentous moments that we hope for. And within that, what did that quote unquote prepare you for when you project? Because talking about bold, I mean, working like and Black Klansman, the subject matter, you know that the subject matter is not going to be like surface. It's not going to. So, what did that prepare you for just future projects from there, such as like Black Klansman?
Sorry, can you say the first part of that question one more time?
I guess just to simplify, it's like, yeah, what did that like working on Lemonade and even seeing like that cut that was different from the general cut, like what did that prepare you for? What did that reveal to you that you future projects like Black Klansman, ones that obviously.
Uh, I don't know. I don't really think about it like that. I kind of on each project, I feel like I'm a complete beginner and I forget my memory is really bad.
Hmm.
So, like on Black Klansman, you read the script and you feel like it's the first script you've ever read, and you're kind of like, "Oh, what the heck? How am I supposed to make this work?" And you're just kind of really confused, and um, and I kind of take that idea and I run with it because you know, uh, rather than viewing it as a weakness, like my memory is a weakness, I actually try to view it as a bit of a strength. And during the pre-production process, I try to relearn everything I know about filmmaking.
Hmm.
And that, even in this period when we're on lockdown, I've been just, you know, binge watching a lot of movies and
Hmm.
dissecting them and breaking it down. Like even, I watched In the Mood for Love, which I love that film, but I also noticed as I was dissecting the film that they intentionally cross the line almost every interaction that they have with the I think the character's Miss Jan and the I can't remember Tony. Tony's the actor. I don't know what his character's name is. But I didn't acknowledge that before at all when I was watching the film. Like I did not know that they were intentionally crossing the line in almost every interaction. Um, so I love kind of like seeing that stuff. I like seeing those devices that they use and how it affects the grammar. And it's a very like film school rule not to cross the line, and I experienced it a lot on Blonde, my last movie, because Andrew Dominic he wanted to pay, he was really rigorous about following that rule, so much to the extent that we would, in the scouting process, we would photograph the room, and he and I would block out the scene as if we were the actors together, and we would shoot every angle. And I have so much footage of him on my phone sitting for Marilyn Monroe. It's so funny, with like a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. Um, that we when we'd get into like the office, we'd be able to see the scene from every single direction, and almost always did we design the scene that's around the line,
Hmm.
which is something that I wasn't really into at first because I don't really believe in it. But uh, but I don't. It's not that I don't really believe in it. I believe in it as it's a device that's meant to be broken, and you can break it as a way to articulate or show somebody, you know, express a metaphor or an impression on the spectator. Like um, uh, in The Mood for Love, that film is entirely impressionistic. Like they observe the characters throughout, but crossing the line in that way is intended to express the subjectivity of the characters, but through a lens that's objective. So it's really interesting kind of watching that, you know, that kind of stuff work out. And then I can kind of figure out a way to apply that or what's interesting about that idea in my own mind and then use that on the next thing, and just trying to keep a library of those kind of ideas
Hmm.
on my phone or my computer so I can remind myself of the different tools available constantly.
And and keeping in line with that, what have been some other um, what have been some other things, maybe during this lockdown or just recently, that have been revealed to you, the devices within uh, cinematic practice? Like, what have been some of the other things revealed to you?
Um, I've always wanted to do a film that just had like the most beautiful print. And when I say print, I mean it as what is being exhibited, the projection or the what's on your screen, like whether that's color timing or the processing that you use or the photochemical processing. Like I always watch certain films and I feel like I'm completely hypnotized by the photograph of it.
Mm.
And I feel that way when I look at still photography too. And there's certain masters out there who just like know how to print a photo. Like Roy de Carava is probably the best at it that I know of. And I remember when Khalil and I did Flypaper, we were interacting with Roy's widow and his daughter, and we would go over their house every week, and they would talk about his dark room was in the basement of the brownstone, and you know, they would just talk about how many hours he would spend in there, and they'd bring out his prints, and you could see that it was very clear, you know, Roy had been passed away for a while, but he had printed all these prints that they were selling in their home himself.
Mm.
And, you know, how much, I think that's actually a large part of his aesthetic was how he printed it.
Mm.
And he would push or pull, or he would do whatever was necessary to kind of make it supreme in his words. And I've always wanted to do that with my own work. But I've always felt like, you know, the the color timing process isn't quite accommodating that right now. But I, you know, even in my own regard, I don't really lean on the color timing process to provide that. Like in most of the stuff that you can see of mine, there's not a lot of color timing going on. Typically, what I'll do is I'll shoot camera tests, and I remember learning really early on how to shoot a camera test. There's this woman named Beverly Wood at Deluxe. She's really famous. You know, she worked for Kodak. She helped invent the stocks. She was a chemist, and then she worked at Deluxe and collaborated with Darius Kanji and Manuel Lubezki and Roger Deakins on making their prints for their films in the late 90s and into the 2000s,
Mm.
or mid to late 90s. And she kind of like told me how to shoot tests with particular film stocks and uh, how to rate it, and that you don't take the rating of the film stock like 500 ISO or ASA or whatever and expose it that way. What you do is you make up your own ISO by rating the stock at a variety of different ISOs and exposing it for that ISO throughout the whole exposure range. And I started doing that, and I would take the footage into DaVinci Resolve and I would apply a LUT, and I would be able to print one exposure up or down to create different textures or grains in the image. And then I would figure out that printer light and that in combination with that LUT, and I would expose the film exactly with that way. So I wouldn't really color time. I was essentially changing the look with the exposure by a thirds of a stop.
Yeah.
And I've always wanted to kind of like come up with a particular alchemy, like a particular exposure mixed with a lens, mixed with a stock, mixed with a whatever, you know,
Yeah.
that just feels really like specific and supreme, you know, it just has this texture that can't really be done. And it's hard to execute that on set because it's really, it takes a lot of discipline to expose to that
Yeah.
specificity.
And do you feel like,
But, sorry.
No, and I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, like, even on, I remember making a mistake on Black Klansman. I was doing some camera tests with my apprentice, Jomo Frey, and I'd received like a Panaflasher from them, a Panaflasher 3.
Mm-hmm.
And I was left to like the last moments of the day to shoot a lot of different stock tests because I was also testing digital, and I had like a anamorphic and spherical lenses, and you know, it was just too much to do in a day. So I pumped through these tests at the very end with Jomo, and I'd flashed this couple frames, and I mistakenly underexposed it by I think maybe 2 stops. And Jomo's dark skinned, and I had him against a dark background, and the image that I got from it, I saw that in the DI theater. I was like, oh my God, it totally defied my expectations, and it made me really excited about, you know, shooting that film and shooting it on film. It was essentially why I shot it on film, was that one image. So, but I don't know if I didn't achieve it at all because it was like way too difficult when I had 3 cameras. The filter had to exist in a 6x6 matte box. We were doing handheld, like it just wasn't possible. And I think I flashed like for 1 week of the footage there, and then one of the filters fell out, or I think it was at like a camera cart, and someone dropped the filter by accident and smashed it all over the ground. And I was doing a stunt with 3 cameras, and one of the cameras wasn't going to be flashed, and I was just like, get this thing out of here. Like, it's never going to work, and it's becoming like a real nuisance. And I was just overwhelmed that, you know, I'd never worked with the crew before. It was our first week, you know, people shooting on film wasn't that common anymore. So I was kind of like struggling with a lot of other really important things. So, but yeah, I guess, you know, to go back to the question, I'm really, really trying to find a way to like shoot something that's really pristine in its print,
Yeah,
you know, and its look.
there's tangibility to that, and I love that you had pointed out like Roy Carver's work, because there's that tangibility, there's that space, that like that texture to the image, and I wonder who are other photographers or ideas within photography that you've implemented within your work or your practice, or like your thoughts about your practice.
Sorry, your question is if I reference other the photographers or something?
Yeah, like
Sorry.
photographers that you are cognizant of that obviously have your practice.
Yeah.
And why?
Bresson kind of has the best words for describing that kind of photography. I think he called it the the fugitive moment.
Yeah.
He called it. So he was talking about, in the still photography, like in some frames. Maybe I'll grab one of his books. Sorry, I'm not that organized.
Good.
Oh, here we
One case is looking for yes,
go. Sorry, you're breaking up there.
just doing commercial for
You know, like a photo like this. Both these photos.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like that's the fugitive moment he's talking about. Like it only happens once, and you essentially have to be like super vulnerable on the set to capture that because it usually happens when you're not rolling.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of like, you know, whenever I see that in any of these stills photographers, whether it's Eggleston or Roy or Bresson or Leonard Freed or, you know, there's Alex Webb and any of those guys, whenever I see that there, I'm just, you know, I become hypnotized by the frame. It just feels so precious and so fleeting. So I don't know. There's just something really magic about it. And I try to do that stuff like on Lemonade and Middays. I did a lot of it. Like there's a lot of shots in that film where I was just starting to roll on the blocking, or when, you know, as soon as the actors got the set, I would start to roll, but I would keep the frame static. I wouldn't like follow them around. I would just observe or
Mm-hmm.
try to make it feel like. I remember there was one kid on my days he'd always sit around the set even if we weren't shooting him.
Mm.
He would always do these like his posture when he was like bored. But he was a young actor who'd done TV work and he'd been on sets a lot, so he knew how to like be present there, but not, you know, it's a lot of young kids, they get bored and they start to like complain or they don't want to be there. Like he was the exact opposite of that. He I could see him being a cinematographer for sure. He was always near me. He was always kind of like hanging out near the camera, but he would always like like shit like this, or there was just like weird things in his posture that you don't see people do when the camera's rolling.
Mm.
And I would like be shooting the scene and then I'd pan the camera over to him and then shoot him and he wouldn't even know I'm shooting him, you know? And I just love that stuff so much. I just like not even capturing it, I love watching it,
Mm.
you know? So when I see that in films, I just get so excited by it, you know? I like that kind of stuff. I was watching this movie last night. I didn't get too far into it, but it was called The Flowers of Shanghai.
Mm.
And the whole opening scene is just this like dinner party. And there's something that the way the conversations were happening, the way the camera was moving, it was just felt really real. And but it was extremely romantic at the same time. And I like that despair, like those two ideas colliding, the raw and the romantic.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's, to me, the polar opposites. But I feel like when you can capture something that's like right reverberating right between the two, and the spectator can't necessarily associate one or the other, like you're defying expectations and it becomes really hypnotic because there's tension in the image.
Mm.
Um,
The great thing is one hopes to do that to themselves, so then hopefully the viewer can live through that experience, you know, because if that excites you, then that's creating this energy for you to continue investigating and continue being open up to that decisive moment, right?
Totally, totally. And I think, you know, I don't know if I feel it, and I'm trying to assume the role of a spectator at most parts. I'm more conscious of the devices because I know what they do, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm not always like, I'm a little bit allergic to kind of symbolism in images too. Like, I don't, I'm much more interested in creating impressions that are metaphors.
Hmm.
And the way I define the difference between the two is a symbol has a singular meaning, a metaphor has a multitude of meanings. Or a metaphor is a question, a symbol is an answer.
Hmm.
And I've always felt like it's the filmmaker's job and the cinematographer's jobs. It's our job to pose a question, not give an answer. And, that's kind of the difference between art and advertising. A work of art is intended to provocate and, uh, you know, um, ask a question. It can be interpreted a bunch of different ways by the spectator, whereas advertising is essentially the advertiser. It's a piece of propaganda. They're telling you how to think.
Hmm.
Um, so they're giving you an answer,
Yeah.
you know.
I'm
And I'm sorry.
no, sorry.
No, I'm just much more interested in the questions. So I'm always like whenever I'm framing up stuff, I don't necessarily know why I'm doing it or trying to be like, okay, I'm trying to get this meaning across to the spectator. Like to me, that's nonsense. Like that's when shit starts looking really contrived.
Hmm.
Um, I think there should be a meaning in there. I'm not totally like, especially in editing. I love it when the meanings are translated in editing, like how you can use match cutting and you can match cut with a metaphor, you can match cut with movement, you can match cut with composition. Like there's always different ways to do it. And I like how editors translate that meaning, but for me, I'm much more trying to create like a soulfulness or like a sense of authenticity so that it kind of becomes more in harmony with what the editor is trying to say and the director is trying to say,
Hmm. Hmm.
which are maybe a little bit more symbolic or so I'm trying to balance something out, I guess, in my mind by becoming a little bit more loose and less dedicated to projecting a meaning. Or if I am trying to project a meaning, I'm trying to it has to have multiple meanings,
Hmm.
not just one.
And speaking of questions, what are some burning questions that you have towards just your own work or your own idea of working? Like, what are some of the questions that in this career you still ask yourself and you're still trying to dig into?
I don't know if I have any. It's I kind of I try not to think too much into the future of stuff. Like really, I receive a script or a treatment or whatever, and instantly I interpret it as a challenge, and I'll start to read into it. I'll start to digest the theme. Sometimes I'll be really repulsed by it because it doesn't. It's giving answers or whatever, or it's it's uh it's talking about an emotion like humiliation or shame or joy or loyalty and those kind of things. And to me, those themes are perfect. Those are questions. Like instantly, if I see a film that's has a scene where a character's humiliated, I think in my mind like, how could it? What should that feel like? Should I observe that? Should I express that subjectively? Um, there's just so many different ways that you can interpret those things, and that's kind of the joy for me in like uh, coming up with stuff or having ideas. But I don't as far as like how I see the future, I don't really know.
Hmm.
Kind of I just take it kind of day by day. I do get when work dries up and it's like slow, you start to question your value and stuff like that, but that's totally different. That's like ego stuff.
One of the last things I kind of want to talk about, ending on a light note, is what what would 11-year-old Chase think about Chase right now? What
Quick.
Sorry?
Hey, sorry, everything
Oh no.
froze up when you were.
I was like, just shut up down. What would 11,
You said 11. How would 11-year-old Chayse look
yeah, like what would
at it?
surprise him the most about you, and what would not surprise him the most?
Well, I first off, I think I would have, I was I was super into basketball when I was 11 or 12 or 13. So I'd be shocked that I wasn't like in the NBA. Which,
Mm,
you know what? I watched this movie, Hoop Dreams, a couple nights ago. Have you guys seen that? Have you seen that? Hoop Dreams?
that one.
Ki- Yeah, that movie fucked me up. I was like 14 when that came out, and I went to the movies with my dad. My dad was like a basketball coach too, and I remember watching that just being like, "Oh my God, like what am I thinking?" You know.
Yeah.
But that the reason I was watching it is because there's really similar themes in that documentary to the film that I was prepping before this whole lockdown happened. Hopefully we still get to make it, but
Mm,
it was like about the bond of a mother and her son and the absence of a father and um, expectations, like uh, all these adult figures around this young man had such high expectations for him, and then he had such high expectations, and
mm-hmm.
you, they were insurmountable. Anyway, I think back to your question, look at if I could see myself from that POV, I think I would just be really shocked that I was a cinematographer at all. But you know what was funny?
Mm.
I I have an uncle in Michigan.
Oh, what part?
Well, half my family's from Detroit, actually. My dad's from Detroit. Uh, my uncle's from Detroit, but they moved to a town called Jackson
Mm.
because my uncle or my dad and my uncle and my grandfather, they all bought a farm out there. Sadly, I, I believe I had an aunt who was, there was some police officers attempted to rape her,
Mm.
and they ended up fleeing Detroit and seeking refuge in this farm town
Mm.
and it was like the first black owned farm
Mm.
in Michigan, and became kind of like a sanctuary for a lot of other members of our really large family. Anyway, I received a letter from my uncle once, or it was actually a box. It was a really heavy box,
Mm.
and I had to go up into Long Island to grab it. And I brought it home and I opened it up, and there was like 12 cameras in there, 12 still cameras. And I was like, what the fuck? And then I started looking through some of the paperwork that's in there, and there's a certificate of photography. And it turns out my grandfather was a photographer. And I never knew this. My dad never told me.
Yeah.
He was like had legit aspirations to be a stills photographer, but as a black man, I don't think he could ever make a career out of it. And he probably struggled with a lot of the same things that Roy struggled with because they would have been the same age.
Mm.
And he ended up being a bus driver. And then when that incident happened, he became a farmer because he didn't want to be in the city anymore. And but to realize that there's this like kind of legacy of photography in my family, it was really interesting. And I called my dad up. I'm like, dude, I got all these cameras from granddad. Like, you never told me he took photos. And he was just like, he just stood there and was like, yeah, he took photos all the time. And I'm like, well, don't you think that's relevant at all? He couldn't put the two together. So, but apparently he had like a dark room in his house and all that stuff.
Mm.
So, but and I'm just like stuff I found out like 2 years ago.
Wow.
So, yeah.
And one thing I'm noticing is that there are I've gotten a few questions from you guys, a little more than expected, and I don't know if you have time for like a
Yeah, totally. I'm down.
Instagram. So a thing to note is Instagram will cut us off at an hour. So I think what we should end this so that we can redo another, so we can do another one so that it doesn't cut off in the middle of our conversation.
Cool.
So I hope you guys
Sounds good.
so far and join us when we restart in a couple seconds. I'll see you in a bit, Chase. And
Cool.
Guys, hey, am I a little clearer now? Maybe second time's a charm. I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's good.
And so I'm gonna wait for people to. Okay, people are trickling back in a little bit here. One of the things that last question I had asked, I think we were just getting to it, but like the things that surprised you the most and don't surprise you. So I'm curious about just continuing this question.
The things that surprised me most about what?
Sorry, 11, like back to like the 11-year-old, like Chase.
Oh, I don't know. I was a pretty bad kid, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I think I'd be surprised I'm not in jail, you know? I just wanted to be a gangster when I was a kid,
Mm.
you know? I remember they put me in the bad class, you know?
Really,
Yeah.
those kids.
Yeah, the bad class, like, and I remember the older bad kids having like really cool t-shirts that said, you know, like fuck you on them and yeah.
That's so funny.
So I'm pretty glad I didn't go down that path. And I don't think I'm a really gentle person at heart, so I don't think I would ever I just wanted to be loved, you know. That was kind of the
Mm.
love and accepted by a bunch of cool kids. So, but I kind of struggled with reading growing up, and I'm dyslexic, so I have like uh, you know, my grades weren't good. I was always kind of, I was in like a special program with a teacher's assistant, so I'd have like, I was like kind of always thought of myself as, not that special.
Mhm.
So, it's kind of cool to, I that's probably goes into a little bit of why I work pretty hard on my shit. It's kind of like, that whole fight or flight kind of kicks in. That's probably where that adrenaline comes from, and
Yeah.
on set. Because in my mind growing up in my childhood, like it was, and I needed to survive, and I'm doing it now. And for some reason, it just clicked in the whole filmmaking thing. And like, I think I was like 16. I
Mhm.
went on set. My mom was teaching music to a production designer, a producer's daughter, and I had the opportunity of going on set with him and kind of observing, and that's when I really saw kind of the challenges on set. And there's something about being on set that's very similar to like a sport. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's like my when I was playing basketball, I'd go into the pocket and I could score a lot of points in a game. And I remember there was a couple games where I was like, I'd scored all the points in the last half, and that was just like me in
Mm.
the pocket. And then I started to feel that on set, like the whole day of production would just go by like that.
Mhm.
It'd be like 12 hours of work and it felt like two.
Yeah.
So,
So absorbed in that, and so I
yeah.
have, so I want to get to some of the questions that people have asked, and I have kind of two last ones in the back of my head that I'm
Cool.
always curious about asking people. And for you, one of them is, what do you feel like is, and maybe we touched on this a little bit, but like, do you feel like one of the biggest responsibilities in your work? Yeah,
What's the biggest responsibility?
or one of them.
Uh,
They're all equal, maybe, you know?
Uh, I really do feel like it's a responsibility. I think I talked about it a little bit with questions, but I think the deeper answer to that is actually empowering the spectator, like
Mm,
engaging with them and not just feeding them kind of, sort of mindless narcotic for them to zone out to. I like being challenged as a spectator, so I value that. And I try to me, it's like a moral thing too.
mm-hmm.
Like it's kind of about integrity, really expressing that integrity in your work. I think that's probably like the most important thing to me is integrity, artistic integrity.
Mm-hmm. And does that lie within the purpose of your work? If so, or if not, then what do you feel like is the purpose of your work?
Uh, yeah, I think that definitely lies in the purpose of my work. I don't know, I just the idea of like taking a job or doing something for money,
Mm-hmm.
it's just, it would just be so painful.
Mm,
Um, and I've never done it. There's definitely times where I said yes to things and then later on I was like, oh, this was a bad decision. But and I would then like kind of, I was thankful and grateful that there was money involved in it. Uh, but I'd never taken anything for money or made decisions out of money. And you know, when you're making a movie, some people use that, like how do we create something that's going to make a lot of money?
mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it feels immoral to me because I don't value
Mm.
that, you know.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's valid because I think the things that are predicated on money, or things that are a little more superficial are just more fleeting. If it's something that's like done with intent and purpose and something that like you nurture and love, then that's timeless. That's an emotion. That emotions are timeless. You know what I mean? But like
Yeah.
something, a certain amount of money or opening at a box office for this, that's fleeting. Cool, you open that box office, but what does that do? But does the person who discovers this film, will they realize that 20 years from now? You know, because making something for like 2 seconds, even within this atmosphere that we all exist in, this we're still wanting that emotion to stay, right?
Yeah, totally. Totally. I was just thinking of something actually as you were talking. I remember I did that Solange music video.
Hmm.
It's kind of like the photo that I posted.
Hmm.
And I remember I went down there and I paid to work on that thing. I remember I was like, I think I spent $15,000 of my own money.
Hmm.
And I rented an Airbnb. I flew in a Focus Puller. I flew in a loader, Skyla. I flew in all my gear, which is I didn't request any reimbursement for any of that stuff. And then I ended up quitting after like 3 days. But it was partially because I made myself too vulnerable. So Solange was showing up like 4 hours late every day,
Mm.
and I was losing my focus puller, and they wanted to continue shooting after the producer had left, and they wanted to shoot in a storm
Mm.
that was happening in Dallas, and I was just like, and the producer told me to take all my gear off the truck because it wasn't insured anymore. And at that point, I was just like, well, I
Shit.
have I have no choice, you know. I can't, you know. And then another producer called me and tried to reassure me that it was going to work and that he was taking over, but I was like, how can you do that in like 24 hours or less?
Yeah.
So I left. But I've kind of always been that kind of guy that just like goes all in a lot, you know. Like I have a lot of equipment that I have accumulated, not even in the last 5 years, I guess, that I usually just donate, you know, to the productions so that so that they can have more resources for art department or for, you know, other needs that the production have that end up on the screen. Because those don't, you know, if it went directly into somebody's pocket, yeah, I'd have a problem with that. But usually it just gets dispersed. Um, and I value that stuff a lot. And I don't really care about the money, you know.
Yeah. I am looking at some of the questions that people have asked, and one of them was, what was a favorite script you read that you eventually shot, or one of them? It doesn't, it doesn't.
um, I haven't done that many movies. I really wish I have. You know, I want to do more. I
Memorable experience, I guess, to further that, like, was the most memorable experience within reading a script? Like, yeah,
I
what?
remember reading this script to Medeiros. That's like one of my first films that I did, and it was only like 60 pages.
Mm,
It's like super short. And man, it was like so beautiful. Like the script was so beautiful. And then halfway through the script, there's this scene that's like really raw.